As Ambassador of Ireland to India, I'm delighted that Ireland is the country partner for Chandigarh Literary Society's digital edition of Literati 2020.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute honor and a great pleasure to welcome Embassy of Ireland as country partner to Chandigarh Literary Society's digital edition, Literati 2020.
We hope that you enjoy learning more about the connections between our two great national poets, Yeats and Tagore, and Kaveri Madhavan's fictionalization of the Irish Rebellion, which took place in Punjab a century ago.
Three passionate artists come together in our next session to talk poetry and take us on a journey and talk about a connection not too many of us know too much about. Irish poet Yeats and Rabindranath Tagore have a very strong historical and biographical relationship revolving around the fact that Tagore's first champion in the West, the person most responsible for his initial success outside of India, was Yeats. This session is another connection between Ireland and India. Dr. Reba Som, an academician, historian, and writer from India, was the director of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations Rabindranath Tagore Centre in Calcutta from 2008 to 2013. She is also a trained singer of Rabindra Sangeet. Emer Davis was born in Ireland and is currently living in India. Several of her poems and short stories have been published in anthologies, journals, and online in Ireland, Italy, UK, USA, and the UAE. She ran the Poetry in the Park event and the Drogheda Creative Writers Workshop in Ireland before moving to India. Recently, two of her poems were published in the COVID-19 anthology, Poetry in the Plague Year. In conversation with Dr. Reba and Emer is Nisha Luthra, a lawyer by education and an art and theatre enthusiast by passion. She is the head of Operations India for Leinster School of Music and Drama in Ireland. Her campaign, Save the Art and the Artist, has been a great help for artists in the Tri-City during the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting to you our next session for the day, Mystical Poetry from Tagore to Yeats.
Good evening to both of you. And first of all, a huge apology from our side, because to keep you waiting backstage, sometimes the virtual platforms can be blessing, and sometimes, they can be a little temperamental also. So many apologies for we kept you waiting. Namaskar, apni kemo achen?
খুব ভালো আছি good to hear you speak Bangla.
Oh yes, ma'am, I'm trying it. Such a sweet language. And hello, Emer. Sláinte.
Sláinte.
So this is a Gaelic way of a greeting. Sláinte means cheers, and Sláinte means the cheers to your health and prosperity. So since our topic today is mystical poetry from Tagore to Yeats, I didn't know how to welcome such creative people, such esteemed guests today. So I chose to recite two poems from their work, and the first is from William Butler Yeats from the Celtic Twilight. May I, ma'am?
Yes.
Let us go forth the tellers of tales, and seize whatever prey the heart longed for, and have no fear. Everything exists, everything is true, and the earth is only a little dust under our feet. This is from Tagore. Where the mind is without fear, and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its elms towards perfection. Into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Both the poems have been written by two different poets of different nationalities, but there is a striking similarity between the themes, tones, and the context and the expression and the depth of the narrative. So, W.B. Yeats and Tagore both were interested in the relationship of spirituality, music, poetry, both used landscapes and nature in their poetic imagery. So, my question is to you, Reba ma'am, that what do you think is the origin of these commonalities between the two poets?
Well, Tagore met Yeats in London in 1912 with his handwritten manuscript of the translation into English of his poems, which became Gitanjali. And he just presented that to Yeats, not realizing that it would cause such an euphoria in literary circles. He was himself so surprised. And Yeats said very succinctly, he said that the prose translations from Tagore had stirred his blood as nothing had for years. Now, how did this happen? I believe that both these poets were steeped in spirituality and not religiosity. Yeats was born in Dublin with a Protestant upbringing. Only later did he become sympathetic with the cause of Irish nationalism, which was Catholic, and which eventually led to the movement for independence. Tagore was of the reformist Brahmo faith. He was not a practicing Hindu. And yet, both believed in the God within, the soul, which Yeats writes in the preface to Gitanjali. He says that Tagore in these verses has discovered his soul and has surrendered himself to it in spontaneity. How beautifully he says so. So I think this is really the connect. At least that's what I feel.
Yes, yes, ma'am. So, what do you think, Emer, would be the connect between the two?
Well, I think, yes, you're right. Yeats, even before he met Tagore, he had been interested in India and in Hinduism. I mean, he had written 3 poems already, one, the Indian to his lover, and that. And though in London at that particular time, there was a lot of people that were interested in Indian culture and in spiritualism. And I suppose by the time when Tagore was coming, people were waiting for him, in a sense, to arrive. There was great excitement that here was a poet whose words they could really feel and sense, because they had been studying Hinduism and especially reincarnation and things like that. So I think that was a big help. And I think when Tagore arrived in London as well, I mean, I believe Yeats had a dinner for him. He invited him around to meet a lot of the London circles of writers at the time. Also, Yeats put on his play, The Post Office, in Dublin at the time, in 1912, and also it was put on in London. And this was a play before it was actually even published. And then Yeats actually got the printing press, which had only just started and was actually mainly doing nationalistic pamphlets, got it published that way. So it was a real boost for Tagore, because, I mean, as we know, then several months later, he got the Nobel Prize and that. And I do think that Yeats was very much one of the people to help that, because, as we know, Tagore was the first non-European to actually get the Nobel Prize at the time.
Yes. So, Emer, do you think that Yeats' poems reflect philosophical sense with earthly love?
Oh yes, yes, and I think, I mean, when he first started, I mean, he was interested in Hinduism and spiritualism, and in India around the 1880s, and when he was a young person, and the imagery that he got from those from Hinduism, he did actually use some of those. He saw a way where he could actually use those images in Irish poetry, and that, but also to give it a context within Ireland. And what he saw, I think, not just with Tagore, but with other writers in India, was how they used their own landscape to get across ideas. And so he experimented with that. And I think that was one of the skills that he had, that where he used a very ordinary topics and subjects with the kind of, and blended that together with the spiritualism and the soul and love in his work. You know, I think that's what he did do.
Very true. Reba, ma'am, like I read in your book, which you wrote on the Rabindranath Tagore, the singer and his song, Tagore's poems reflect a spiritual sense and divine love. So how do you put some light on this, ma'am?
Yeah, but before I come to that, I'd like to respond a bit to what Emma spoke about, which is so very relevant. This was the time when Tagore came to England, and there was this kind of atmosphere already, with people like William Rothenstein coming to Calcutta and meeting Tagore before, and this interest in India, or the Indian way of thought, Hinduism in particular. And Yeats actually was very close to a theosophist called Mohini Chatterjee, and delved into Hinduism, and later on, interestingly, translated into common English from Sanskrit several of the Upanishads. This is very interesting. So this was already there, which was the kind of background in which he greeted and met Tagore and reacted and responded to Tagore. Now, coming to your question, I think both these poets, both Tagore, and you asked something about the earthy love and divine love, but I think above all, both these poets were disillusioned with modern civilization, and they both recalled the lost civilizational values and celebrated simple living. Yeats, in his poem Sailing to Byzantium, wrote about dying generations caught in sensual music, fish, flesh, foul, whatever is begotten, born and dies. Byzantium for him was a metaphor of a spiritual journey, when despite the agony of old age, spiritual work was required to restore vitality, and the soul had to be invoked. And similarly, Tagore called for divine blessing to take man out of the crisis of the soul, which he was facing. And I quote from one of the most celebrated songs from Gitanjali, when he writes, this is Tagore writing, when all grace goes into hiding, appear before me as the nectar of music. When desire blinds the mind in a dusty haze of delusion, O pure one, O wakeful one, appear in your brilliant radiance. So they were both invoking this special sense of energy, if you will, divine energy, if you will, because of what they saw around them, and they were disillusioned. So I think that is what seems to be so very common between these two.
Gee, I'm so mesmerized by the words that you just recited, ma'am. So, both Yeats and Tagore have been a beacon, a guide, a poet, and a philosopher for their respective nations. So, I would like to ask Reba, ma'am, please put some light on this.
Well, I think Tagore was a Renaissance personality. He was born into a very talented family with brothers and sisters who were budding poets, dramatists, singers. And Tagore grew up in this florescence of culture in his ancestral home. And Yeats also came from a very artistic family with his artist father, brother, sisters. All of them were involved in the Arts and Craft Museum, which is what Emma was referring to. And the political sympathies of Yeats was drawn to the Irish Home Rule movement and Irish culture, Irish identity. And Tagore also was drawn into fashioning the Bengali identity at a time when Bengal was partitioned in 1905, and there was the Swadeshi movement. And he wanted to explore the indigenous roots of Bengali culture. And he, although English education had been introduced in Calcutta, in British India, and it was in many ways beneficial for people who got jobs and so on. But Tagore himself felt that the mother tongue was very important, and it should be introduced in a common education system and platform so that the rural-urban divide would not be there. Isn't that prophetic? Because that's exactly what has happened. English is important, but we need to know our roots, our mother tongue, and Bengali.
Indeed.
And mind you, Tagore's English was perfect. He was tutored at home. He was very diffident about his English, but that will come to later on, yeah.
Yes, and Emer, do you think that Yeats also led your country to a progressive path through his poetry?
I think in relation to his poetry, I think he was a cultural ambassador. And again, a bit like Tagore, he came from a very artistic family. And his brother was an artist, his father was a great dramatist and actor. So, and other siblings were also involved in cultural activities as well. And I suppose coming from that background, he very much believed in preserving the culture identity of the country. And through the Renaissance revival, Irish Renaissance revival, I mean, that was one of his themes that he wanted to do. I think he drew from imagery of ordinary people and rural imagery. He used Irish legends and folklores in some of his stories, and that he set up the Irish National Theatre, which is the Abbey Theatre, which is still going today. I think one of the things is that it was his use of rhyme and stanza forms that was really important. And everybody in school in Ireland would have studied Yeats. And I think one of the other things is that anywhere you go abroad, you will find a Yeats book, and it seems very people find it. They're able to understand his poems. I mean, one of my favorite ones is called "When You Are Old," and if you kind of listen to the rhythm of it, and I'll just read a couple of lines like, "When you are old and grey and full asleep, and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep." And if you can just get that rhythm, and it doesn't matter what culture you are actually in, you can get that sense of rhythm. And I think that's what makes him such a great poet for Ireland. And he's always somebody that you go back to. He's always somebody that I go back to. I mean, sometimes I wouldn't have read some of his poems for a long time, but then when I go back to them and you read the words and you feel the fullness of them and the beat in them. And I think that's what's really, really important in what he's given us.
Yes. I think both the poets were restless under the British influence, and both proved to be a literary renaissance for their countries. What do you think, Reba, ma'am? His poetry was greatly influenced. Both their poetry was greatly influenced by the restlessness which was as a colony of our country.
Well, yes. I mean, both poets faced the indignity of British colonial oppression, and which shaped their poetic sensitivity. Yeats was shaken by the merciless killings of leaders of the Irish nationalist movement in the Easter Rising of 1916, which eventually led to the independence of Southern Ireland in 1921. Tagore was appalled by the senseless killing of peaceful protesters in Jallianwala Bagh in Punjab in 1919, which led him to give up the knighthood which the British government had bestowed on him. So that imprint is very much there in both, in their poetic responses.
Yes, yes. Emer, your point of view on that, please.
Yes, Yeats, I mean, I suppose with Yeats, he, at times, he would have supported the national cause. There's kind of an ambivalence there because of what he wanted out of that. I think certainly when he first met the Irish patriot John O'Leary, he became very much involved in the nationalist cause, and then for a while, then that he kind of moved away from that because actually he didn't really like violence or protest very much. He didn't find much time for that, but he was in love with Maud Gonne, and she was a revolutionary, and he basically came back into that. And I think even at the time of 1916, when that first happened, he wasn't in favour of it, but actually it's what happened at the executions of the leaders, and that really changed his view and his stance on it. And I think his poem, it really remains one of his greatest political statements. And I'll just read it because I think it really just stands out. For all that is done and said, we know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pearse. Now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. And it's that line, a terrible beauty is born, which raises the question that Yeats was not happy with the future that he saw Ireland was going in, the direction it was going in. He did come from an Anglo-Irish Protestant background. It was an aristocracy. He didn't really have much time for the middle classes. And so he could see there was going to be the end of that lifestyle and something different, which he wasn't really in favour of, and that.
Yes, going back to Miss Gonne even said to him that poets never marry. So it's good that you are not married to me because you're giving us such good poetry and you're turning your unhappiness into happiness. He actually turned his unhappiness, his misery, his dejection into this beautiful form of poetry. That's so beautiful.
Absolutely,
so Yeats,
absolutely.
That is always the case. That is always the case. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thoughts. Even Tagore had his muse in the woman he loved and who died.
Exactly.
Is Kadambari Devi.
Oh, all right. I didn't know about that, ma'am. That
Oh,
is news to me.
that's a huge story. That's his
Oh, wow.
sister-in-law, his sister-in-law,
Oh,
and who had
okay.
entered the Tagore household as a child bride, and he grown up with, and they both loved each other and loved poetry. But she was married to his elder brother, and when Tagore himself got married,
Hmm.
soon 4 months after that, she committed suicide, and she remained his literary muse in all his work.
How beautiful. How beautiful. I didn't know that about it.
Very tragic.
I knew about
Yeah.
Yeats. Yeah.
Yes.
So Yeats distinctively praised Tagore when he read the manuscript of Gitanjali, his short poems. So Reba ma'am, my question is directed to you. Do you really think that Yeats' appreciation made Tagore more acceptable in the West?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that the fulsome praise of Yeats for Tagore and his glowing tribute in the preface of the book Gitanjali paved the way for a greater recognition of Tagore in the literary circle. And of course, Tagore went on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. But I want to mention two things here, which are important. First is that Yeats had problems with Tagore's English, which he did not. And mind you, some people think that Gitanjali poems were edited by Yeats. That's not true. Yeats helped to organize them, to arrange them. And he wrote this glowing tribute in the preface. And later on, Yeats even went on to say that Tagore's English was a foreigner's English. And he even mentioned that nobody can write with music and style in a language not learnt in childhood. Now, the two languages, Bengali and English, are very different in their expression. I mean, English is crisp, understated, subtle. Bengali is expansive, sentimental, and effusive. And Tagore himself admitted several times that English was not his first language and that he sometimes felt pretty uncomfortable expressing himself in it. Now, all this is said and done, but what is it then Yeats that he appealed to Yeats? It was the simplicity and the innocence of the verses that appealed to him, that pulled at his heartstrings. And because he writes in the preface that the lyrics had a subtlety of rhythm and a delicacy of color which are not translatable. And yet he says, and this I think is one of the finest things that he says that these verses would be there to stay for all time. They would not just be a decorative coffee table book on ladies' tables. He says this because they would be sung by generations. And that has been proved to be true. Time has proved that to be true. The second point I wanted to mention in this is that Gitanjali was just a small collection of poems. His real genius was to come later when when he penned his major works. And in fact, Yeats, when he met Tagore later, complimented him on I think it was Ghore Baire, the Home and the World. And Tagore's protagonist in Gora is an Irishman. That's also interesting. But, you know, the Nobel Prize itself, Yeats felt, was actually a political choice. He didn't place so much importance to it. Even Tagore's Nobel Award in 1913, he felt, and I quote, he said, it's a piece of wise imperialism from the English point of view, which would perhaps soften anti-colonial sentiments in India. And when Yeats himself won the Nobel Prize 10 years later, in 1923, he again commented that it's not a recognition for him as an individual, but a symbolical victory for Ireland, which has just received its independence. I wanted to make these 2 points.
Yes, ma'am. The same question to you, Emer. Do you think that Tagore's on Tagore's scintillating writing, the stamp of Yeats actually satiated Western readers' thirst for Eastern spiritual guidance? Do you think that Westerns were really looking for something like that for solace and for calm, the kind of poetry Tagore was writing?
Yes, I mean, in London at that particular time, there was lots of groups that were meeting and that were studying spiritualism at that time. I mean, as we know, Yeats was very much involved in the Golden Dawn at the time and was involved in that for over 30 years. And so I think it was a phase that people were going through. Now, for Yeats himself, I mean, he actually maintained his interest in spiritualism and Eastern spiritualism and Hinduism right throughout his life. He kind of went in and out of it, but he certainly did keep it, and you can see it in his later poems as well. And that, yeah. And I think with having Yeats, I suppose we've got to remember is that Yeats was only starting out as a poet. He wouldn't have had that many poems published at that particular time, whereas Tagore would have had a lot more at that stage and was recognised. Maybe not so much in Europe, but so I think he did help in that sense. I think what Yeats did, he was looking for a certain way of interpreting Tagore's poems. And one can see that it's the way that he saw maybe the religion or India the way that it was. And you have to remember that Yeats had never visited India and that. Yeah. And a lot of his views about India and spiritualism and Hinduism would have come from those circles that he was in. Yeah. So it may not have been the most rounded interpretation of spiritualism and of Tagore, but I think the essence of it, certainly, yes, he was there, and it opened up a new circle for Tagore on that, and certainly when he went back, he was actually able to open his school and that. And I thought it was an interesting point that Tagore's when the play was put on, the Post Office, Padraig Pearse's play was also put on at the same time, and then years later, Tagore actually put on the Padraig Pearse's play in India. At his school. So, there was that interest. It just shows you that there was still the connection there, and that, Yep.
It's amazing because the Post Office Dark was published first by Yeats at the Kuala Press. Right, yes. I mean, that's amazing. Yeah. And it was performed at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin.
Yeah.
Reba ma'am, do you think that they both shared a global vision of modernism? I mean, they played an important role, and they both challenged imperialism grammar of divide and rule.
Yeah, I mean, they both had this global vision. I think Tagore believed in a universal humanism, pluralism, coexistence of different cultures and religions within one crucible of humanity. This was the motto of his Vishwa Bharati University, where he saw the world coming together in one nest. In fact, it was a unique expression of the assimilation of cultures of the world. And he invited international scholars and faculty, as well as, experts from all over India, so that the academic atmosphere of Vishwa Bharati would have an eclectic culture. And Yeats also yearned for the wisdom and simplicity of Ireland. I remember reading a poem on the fisherman, where he mentions that in the face of the humble fisherman is embodied a certain wisdom which was sadly lost in urban degradation. So these were the essential foundational values that both of them believed in and yearned for, I think.
Yes, ma'am. And Eva, do you think that Yeats, after all those years, is he still a cultural ambassador for your country?
Oh yes, very much so. And I think, I mean, you only have to look at um, uh, uh, he had in the National Library in Dublin. I mean, they have an
Yeah.
exhibition there, full-time exhibition of his work there, and
Mm.
parts of it changes on a regular basis. Also, I mean, many singers have also interpreted his work. There's the band The Waterboys, which did a full album of some of his poems. There's also another singer, Carla Bruni, who also did in some of his poems with music. So he's very much there. He's somebody that everybody goes back to. I mean,
Mm.
if you're ever stuck for looking how to construct a poem, he's the person to go back to. And I mean, the thing is, because one of the things compared to most poets at that particular time, especially in Europe, they were moving away from rhyme and they were going more for free verse. He was still using rhyme all the time, and he kept going back. And that's one of the things that Seamus Heaney said. He really admired his craftsmanship and how even as he went on in life, he still went back to look at the poems, to restructure them. And I think that's why. I mean, he was a poet throughout his whole life. He wrote really good poems throughout his whole life, and I think that's what's really, really important.
Yes, I think so too, because Reba ma'am would agree with me that both the poets remained relevant in the post-colonial eras also, maybe because of all these qualities. So, ma'am, Reba ma'am, you are here, and I really would request you before we go that kindly recite a few lines, because you are, you are a classical singer, and your Rabindranath Sangeet is in your blood. So if we could just hear a few lines from you, ma'am.
Yeah, actually, talking about the relevance of these two great poets,
Ji.
I mean, as mentioned by Emma, even with Tagore, he's so relevant because, you know, both the national anthems of India and Bangladesh are his compositions, and they are a constant refrain. And I don't think we have forgotten our Tagore. I mean, there's
Not.
something so profound about him that
Ji.
he remains relevant. And I think, I mean, listening to Emma, if I can just mention that in these days of Corona, when suddenly the world as we've known it has changed in a very surreal kind of way, those two lines seem prophetic when he says, all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. He said it in one context, but I can almost, feel that it can be applicable in our present day
So
context.
relevant. Yes,
Yes.
yes.
You want me to? Yeah, well, I can sort of recite again from Tagore's Gitanjali,
Sure, ma'am.
a poem, first his own translation in English, and then in his original Bangla. That's what you want to
Right.
hear.
Yes, ma'am.
Thou hast made known to me friends whom I knew not. Thou hast given me seats in homes not my own. Thou hast brought the distant near and made brother of the stranger. কত অজানারে জানাইলে তুমি, কত ঘরে দিলে ঠাঁই, দূরকে করিলে নিকট বন্ধু, পরকে করিলে ভাই.
How sweet, ma'am. I mean, the way you say it, the way you recite makes all the difference. Thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you for these interesting and intriguing stories. And thank you for giving us insight and into your minds. And I'm sure this conversation has inspired our audiences like it has inspired me. And it is unfortunate that we cannot welcome you physically in our constant permanent venue like for last 8 years, the Lake Club Chandigarh, but we had to meet on this virtual platform. But at CLS Chandigarh, we take it as blessing in disguise that I'm in a remote town of Rajasthan, and you're in Kolkata, and Emer is in New Delhi, and we could all have this conversation together. Thank you so much. And before signing off, I would like to thank Embassy of Ireland for being associated with us as a country partner. Thank you so much for the authors, poets, and artists like you both who really believed in our vision. And thank you for a technical team to put it all together. Thank you so much, ma'am, before we meet again. Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.